What kind of woman crosses 2,000 miles just to marry a stranger she's never met? And what kind of man looks at a wooden crate full of noisy chickens and sees not inconvenience, but possibility? In the vast, unforgiving lands of Montana, where loneliness can swallow a soul whole, two lives are about to collide in the most unexpected way. But what begins as an arrangement might just become something far greater. Stay with me, because this is not just a story about survival. It's a story about finding home where you least expect it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more stories like this.
As the stagecoach wheels stopped, a cloud of trail dust settled on the Red Creek Station platform, where Elizabeth Lizzie Carter stood holding a wooden crate tight to her body. A loud squawking from inside the box made folks turn and stare. It was a hot afternoon in late August of 1882, and the Montana heat beat down on the ranchers and townsfolk gathered to see John Walker's mail-order bride arrive. Elizabeth's dark red hair was tucked under a simple bonnet, and her green eyes searched the crowd with both fear and hope. She had come almost 2,000 miles from her home in Pennsylvania, answering a notice from a rancher who needed a wife to help build a life out west. The advertisement never said a thing about whether the man would accept a woman who brought her 6 best egg-laying hens with her. A tall man broke away from the crowd, his boots kicking up little dust puffs as he walked toward her. John Walker was 30 years old, with broad shoulders and a lean frame earned from years under a hot sun. His hair was long, and he had a few days of stubble on his jaw, but his blue eyes looked right at her, making Elizabeth stand up a little straighter. He stopped about 3 feet from her, his eyes dropping from her face down to the crate where a few red feathers stuck out from between the boards. "Miss Elizabeth." His voice was rough, like a man who yelled across fields more than he talked in quiet rooms. "Yes, Mr. Walker. I do apologize for the ruckus. The trip was hard on them." Elizabeth moved the crate in her arms, feeling the bird's warmth. She readied herself for him to be mad or let down, expecting him to declare that the chickens had to go. John came a step closer and looked through the openings at the hens huddled inside. A brave one stared back at him with a shiny yellow eye, and he had to fight back a smile. He thought he was getting a fancy lady from back east, the kind who might fuss about the rough life on a ranch. But this woman had carried chickens halfway across the country. "Well, the ranch just got a whole lot richer," John said, his voice sounding kinder than he meant it to. "We have not had a fresh egg in nearly 8 months. The coyotes took our last hens back in January." Elizabeth felt so relieved that her knees just about gave out. She had worried about this moment the whole trip, planning what she would say to defend her birds and preparing for him to send her away. "They are fine layers. The Rhode Island Reds are especially good, and I brought plenty of feed to get them started here." John reached out for her travel bag, and his work-roughened fingers grazed hers as he lifted it from her shoulder. A small shock passed between them, and Elizabeth thought she saw something in his eyes just before he looked away toward a nearby wagon. "The ranch is about an hour's ride north of here. I have got some supplies to pick up, and then we ought to get going before it gets any hotter." She walked behind him to the wagon, still holding her crate of hens, feeling all the eyes and hearing the whispers of the people watching them. A mail-order bride was always a big deal in these little towns, but one showing up with her own livestock was cause for even more talk. As John went to find the station master, an older woman with a kind face and silver hair came over. "I am Martha Collins. I own the boarding house in town." The woman's eyes smiled warmly. "You must be worn out, my dear. That is a long way to travel." Elizabeth Lizzie Carter, or I suppose soon to be Elizabeth Walker. The full weight of her decision suddenly hit her again. She was about to marry a man she did not know and live on his remote ranch, far from everything she had ever known. The hens in her crate made soft noises, and the sound gave her a bit of comfort. Martha smiled and said, "John is a good man. He lost his folks to a fever 5 years ago and has been working that place all by himself. He runs himself ragged most of the year. He needs a woman with some grit and good sense, not some wilting flower who'll fold at the first sign of trouble. She pointed toward the chicken crate. I reckon you're just what the man needs. John came back with sacks of flour and sugar before Elizabeth could answer, loading them onto the wagon with an easy strength. He tied down her trunk next to the supplies and then helped her up to the wagon seat. His hands were strong but gentle, and she felt his jaw clench for a moment as she sat down beside him, placing the chicken crate by her feet. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," Elizabeth shouted as John picked up the reins. The older woman gave a wave as she headed back to her boarding house. The wagon jolted forward, and the town of Red Creek slowly disappeared. The Montana land rolled on forever, covered in sagebrush with a few cottonwood trees here and there. In the distance, mountains stood with a little snow still on their highest peaks. Even with the summer heat, Elizabeth had never seen a place so wide and open. Pennsylvania was all rolling green hills and thick woods, where you could never see very far. Here, the sky was endless. They traveled without speaking for the first 20 minutes, with only the wagon wheels creaking, the harness ringing, and a few clucks from the crate. Elizabeth kept stealing looks at the man next to her, trying to match the person from the letters with this sun-baked rancher who handled the reins so easily. His letters were short but truthful, telling her about the hard life on the ranch and making it plain he wanted a partner, not a pretty doll. She had liked his honesty and had been just as straightforward about her own life. At 23, Elizabeth had few good choices left in Philadelphia. Her father had passed on 2 years before, leaving behind debts that took all of his money. Her mother had remarried a man who let Elizabeth know she was not wanted in his house. Her job as a seamstress barely paid for her small room, and her future looked like a long, empty hallway. Then her friend Sarah showed her the advertisements in the paper. Elizabeth had to read John Walker's words 3 times before she got the courage to write back. "The ranch has about 500 head of cattle right now," John finally said. "We have got different pastures for summer and winter, and I have got 2 men who help out. Tom Brennan and his boy Davy. They stay in the bunkhouse. Tom's wife passed on some time ago, and the boy is about 15 now. They are both hard workers." Elizabeth nodded, glad he was telling her these things. "What will you need me to do besides the cooking and house chores?" John thought about it for a moment, his eyes fixed on the rutted path. "To be honest, whatever you are willing to help with. On a ranch, there is no such thing as his work or her work. During calving or roundup, everybody does what needs doing. But I would not ask you to do anything you cannot handle." "I am a lot stronger than I look," Elizabeth told him in a quiet voice. "And I am not scared of hard work." He turned to look at her then, a real look, and she held his gaze without flinching. A silent understanding formed between them. They had both faced tough times and had decided to fight instead of give up. "So, why the chickens?" John asked, and his voice was full of real interest, not judgment. Elizabeth glanced down at her crate, where the hens were now quiet. "My grandmother gave me the first 2 when I was 12 years old. She showed me how to raise them, how to get good layers, and how to keep them well through the cold months. After everything else in my life fell to pieces, I still had my hens. They gave me something to do and a little money from selling their eggs. I just could not leave them. They are all the family I have got left." The simple truth of her story touched a deep part of John. He knew what it was like to hold on to something like that. Some things just had to hold steady when the rest of the world was shifting. When his folks passed, he poured everything he had into this place. He needed the hard work, the feel of the land his father cherished. "There is a good piece of ground by the barn for a chicken coop," he said. "We will have to build it strong. The varmints out here do not give up easy." A wave of relief and something more washed over Elizabeth. "I can help with that. I know my way around a hammer." The edges of his mouth turned up, almost like he was about to smile. "I expect you do." They kept heading northwest. The sun rode high even though the afternoon was getting on. As they went, John pointed things out, giving names to far-off mountains and tracing the edges of his property. He told her the Walker Ranch was near 3,000 acres, land his father settled and made his own 20 years back. It was a tough land with winters that could break you and bone-dry summers, but the grazing was fine, and a creek that never ran dry cut right through the place so water was sure. "We will be married tomorrow," John said as they came over a small hill. "The traveling preacher is supposed to be nearby, so I sent a message for him to come to the ranch. If that is all right with you." Elizabeth felt her heart pound inside her chest. Tomorrow, she would be a wife. "Yes, that is fine with me." "If you need another day or two," John started, but Elizabeth shook her head. "No. We both knew what we were getting into with this. There is no reason to wait." She waited a moment, then said quietly, "Unless you are having second thoughts." "I am not having second thoughts." His voice was steady. When she glanced at him, his face was serious, but there was no meanness in it. "I will do all I can to be a good husband to you, Elizabeth. I cannot say it will be an easy life, but I can say I will treat you right and be honest." "That is all a person can ask," Elizabeth said, and she meant every word. She did not travel all this way looking for some grand romance. She came here for a steady life and a partner, a chance to make something that mattered. If feelings were to grow later on, well, that would be an extra blessing. But she was a practical woman. She knew plenty of marriages started with a lot less than respect and a common goal. They rounded a curve in the trail, and the ranch appeared. Elizabeth leaned ahead, wanting to see her new home. The house itself was a solid log building with a long covered porch across the front. It was bigger than she had imagined. It had real glass windows shining in the sun and a stone chimney on one side. Close by was a large red barn, a corral holding a few horses, and a smaller building she figured was the bunkhouse John spoke of. Past the main buildings, fencing stretched out across pastures where cattle were grazing here and there. The place was rugged and far from town, sitting right on the edge of the wild. But Elizabeth felt a tight spot in her chest loosen up. This was real. This was solid ground. A person could make a life right here. As the wagon got closer, two men came out of the barn. John lifted a hand to greet them. The older one was worn by the sun and work, his face a map of lines. But he still moved quick. The younger one was a lanky teenager, all sharp angles and clumsy height, with sandy-colored hair in his eyes. "Tom, Davy, this is Miss Elizabeth Lizzie Carter," John announced, pulling the wagon to a halt by the house. "Elizabeth, this is Tom Brennan and his son, the men I told you about." "A pleasure to meet you, ma'am," Tom said, pulling his hat right off his head. Davy did the same, his ears turning red as he mumbled hello. "The pleasure is all mine," Elizabeth replied with a warm voice. Just then, the chickens decided to raise a fuss, squawking loudly. Everyone looked down at the crate by her feet. A big grin spread across Tom's leathery face. "Well now, that is a sound I have not heard on this ranch in a long while. Miss Elizabeth brought us some laying hens," John explained as he hopped down from the wagon. He walked around to her side and offered a hand to help her to the ground. His hand was warm and calloused in hers, and she felt his strength as he helped her down. "This ranch is a richer place already," Tom said, repeating what John had said before. You could hear he was truly pleased. "My boy here has been griping for months that we do not have any fresh eggs." Davy's face got even redder, but he was looking at that chicken crate with real interest. "Can I help settle them in, Mr. Walker?" "Let us get Miss Elizabeth situated first," John replied. "Elizabeth, I will show you inside. Tom, could you and Davy bring in the supplies?" "Of course, boss." Tom was already grabbing the flour sacks, and Davy went to help him. John picked up Elizabeth's trunk like it was light as a feather and motioned for her to follow him to the house. She took hold of the chicken crate herself, not trusting her birds to anyone else, and went up the 3 porch steps. John held the door for her, and she walked into the cool, dim room. The main room was big, with a huge stone fireplace on one wall and a solid table with 6 chairs in the middle. A kitchen was set up in the back corner with a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, and open shelves full of plates and provisions. 2 closed doors led out of the main room. "That is my room," John said, tipping his head toward the door on the left. "It was my parents' room before that. The other is a spare room, but it is mostly filled with storage at the moment. You can take whichever one you want. I can empty out the spare room if you would like your own space." Elizabeth knew exactly what he was offering her. Separate rooms. A marriage of convenience, for now at least. It was a thoughtful thing to do, giving her time to get used to things. But she was practical, and she knew this marriage would have to be a real one sooner or later. They would need children to help work a place this big. Besides that, she felt a surprising pull toward this serious, kind man, who did not even blink when she showed up with a crate of chickens. "We can talk about the sleeping arrangements after we are married," she said, choosing her words with care. "Right now, I need to get these hens situated. They have been cooped up for days and need some water and room to stretch." John put her trunk down and nodded. "I will help you put together a temporary pen. Then we can build a proper coop in the next few days." For the next hour, they built a makeshift pen for the chickens, using leftover wood and wire that Tom found in the barn. John worked quietly and quickly, measuring and sawing while Elizabeth held the board steady and drove the nails in with sure swings. At last, they let the hens out into their new pen. Elizabeth threw down some feed and filled a low pan with fresh water. The chickens went right to scratching in the dirt, checking out their new surroundings with a hopeful caution. "They are going to like it here," Elizabeth said, watching them with a satisfied feeling. "I hope you will too," John said in a quiet voice. And when she turned to see him, she noticed a flicker of doubt in his eyes for the very first time. This strong, steady man who ran this whole ranch and stared down every hardship was worried if she would find his home good enough. "I think I will be," Elizabeth said, and she meant it. "This is beautiful country, and the ranch is much more than I ever expected. You have built something truly impressive here, John." His shoulders seemed to drop just a little. "My father got it started. I have just tried to do right by his work. Come on. I will show you around the rest of the place before the sun goes down." They walked around the ranch together. John showed her the well for fresh water, the root cellar cut into a hill for storing food, and the smokehouse for curing meat. He pointed out the vegetable patch, which was mostly full of weeds with only a few sad-looking plants growing. "I do not have a knack for gardening," John confessed, looking sadly at the overgrown spot. "I can keep livestock healthy, but plants seem to die just to spite me." Elizabeth laughed, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both. "I can handle a garden. My grandmother taught me well about that, too. We will have fresh vegetables on the table before the first frost hits." They walked on past the barn where the horses nickered softly in their stalls, and up to a rise with a view over most of the ranch. The sun was starting to sink behind the mountains, coloring the sky with streaks of gold and pink. Cattle were scattered across the pastures, and the creek John had told her about shone like a silver ribbon winding through the valley. "It is just breathtaking," Elizabeth said, her voice soft. "It is home," John answered, and she could hear the deep contentment in his voice. "It can be a hard life and a lonely one, but I cannot picture living anywhere else. I hope that does not sound like a foolish thing to say." "Not at all. I know what it means to be tied to a place, to a certain way of living." Elizabeth turned to look at him, and the evening wind played with the loose strands of her hair. "I want you to know something, John. I will work as hard as I can to be a good partner to you. I will earn my keep here." "You already have," he said, and his blue eyes were completely serious. "You traveled all this way with just a trunk and some chickens, all to start a new life with a man you did not know. That takes more grit than most folks can find in a lifetime." A warm feeling spread through Elizabeth's chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. Maybe it was hope, or maybe the start of something more. She met his eyes for a long moment. Then he cleared his throat and pointed back to the house. "We ought to head back. Tom and Davy should have supper cooking by now. They are not the best cooks, but they get by all right." Dinner was simple: fried salt pork, beans, and biscuits that were just a little blackened on the bottom. The four of them sat at the big table, and Elizabeth was taken with the easy way John and his ranch, 2 men. They talked about the herd, argued about putting up a new fence on the north pasture, and made their plans for the week ahead. She stayed quiet and listened, getting to know the way they talked and the problems they dealt with. "If you do not mind me saying so, ma'am," Tom said when they were done eating, "it is good to hear another voice around here. These two do not talk much most nights." Elizabeth gave a small smile. "Well, I am glad to be of some service, though I have to admit I do not know a thing about raising cattle yet." "You will pick it up fast enough," Tom told her. "And if you can get that garden growing and provide us with eggs, you will be worth more than gold to us." After they ate, Tom and Davy went out to the bunkhouse, which left John and Elizabeth by themselves in the darkening room. John lit a few oil lamps that made the room feel warm, and Elizabeth started to clear the plates. "Don't worry about those," John said. "It has been a long trip for you. You need your rest." "I am not so fragile that a few dishes will hurt me," Elizabeth answered, but her voice was soft. She poured hot water from the stove into a basin and started washing the dishes quickly and neatly. John stood and watched her for a second, then he grabbed a towel and started to dry. They worked in a comfortable quiet, the simple task feeling strangely close. Once done, John fetched Elizabeth's trunk from the doorway. "I'll set this in the spare room for now," he told her. "We'll sort out permanent spots tomorrow after we are wed." Elizabeth nodded, weariness hitting her hard. The truth of the last few days finally washed over her. A week ago, she was in Philadelphia deciding to come west. Now she was in a Montana cabin on a remote ranch, about to marry a near stranger. John must have seen it on her face because his own expression gentled. "I know this is a whole lot to take in. If you have concerns, just say so." "I am all right," Elizabeth answered, her voice trembling. "Just worn out from the day." "Get some rest," John said softly. "Things are clearer in the morning." He led her to the extra room, full of ranch gear, but holding a small bed with a quilt. Her trunk was at its foot, a wash basin and pitcher set nearby, likely Tom's doing. "Good night, Elizabeth," he said. "Good night, John." The door closed and she sank onto the bed, her legs weak. Through the wall she could hear him, moving about the main room, banking the fire and getting ready for bed. Tomorrow she would be his wife. Her life was about to change for good. Elizabeth put on her nightgown and lay on the strange bed, looking at the dark rafters overhead. A coyote yipped somewhere out in the dark, and she heard her hens clucking, restless in their new pen. She figured she ought to check on them, but she was too bone-tired to move. The last thing she pictured before drifting off was John's hands, strong and steady, helping her down from the wagon. Morning came way too soon, with a rooster's crow that jolted her awake before she recalled where she was. Sunshine poured in the window, and she could hear voices from the next room. She quickly got into a good dress, a dark blue one, and pinned up her hair. Her hands trembled as she worked the tiny buttons. When she came out, the breakfast on the table was a world away from last night's meal. The smell of fresh biscuits, fried eggs, bacon, and coffee filled the whole cabin. "Mrs. Walker got those first eggs from your hens this morning," Tom said, looking mighty pleased. "They are fine birds, ma'am." Elizabeth felt a sudden swell of pride. "So they have taken to their new home." "Seems that way," John said, handing her a tin mug of coffee. Their fingers touched, and she saw in his eyes that he felt that little jolt, same as she did. "That rooster has got a lot to say." "That is Henry. He takes his job to heart." Elizabeth took the coffee, and its warmth helped steady her. They ate their meal, talking about everything except the wedding planned for that afternoon. "Preacher Thomas should be here around 2 o'clock, John noted, as if it were nothing special. After eating, Tom and Davy went to see to the cattle, leaving the two of them alone. John went to his room and came out in fresh clothes, his face clean-shaven and his hair still damp. The sight of him made her pause. He was not handsome in a classic sense, too serious and worn by the sun, but he was compelling. He had a solidness about him that she found herself drawn to. "You look real nice," John told her, his gaze on her blue dress and neat hair. "Thank you. You as well." The stilted words felt silly, but neither knew what else to say. Tom and Davy came back just before 2 o'clock, all scrubbed clean and in their Sunday clothes. Reverend Thomas arrived right on the dot, a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a worn Bible. "Mrs. Walker, Miss Elizabeth, I am honored to join you two," he said, shaking both their hands. "Shall we get started?" They all stood before the hearth with Tom and Davy as their witnesses. The preacher opened his book and began the service, his voice smooth from saying these words so many times before. Elizabeth could not focus on the words, just on keeping her breath even and her hands from shaking. "Do you, John William Walker, take this woman as your wedded wife, to have and to hold for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, till death do you part?" "I do." John's voice was firm and his eyes stayed right on Elizabeth. "And do you, Elizabeth Marie Carter, take this man as your wedded husband, to have and to hold for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, till death do you part?" Her own voice came out steadier than she imagined. "I do." "Will you be exchanging rings?" the preacher asked. From his pocket, John brought out a plain gold band, surprising Elizabeth. He had never mentioned a ring, and she certainly had not expected one in this practical arrangement. It looked a little worn, and she knew right away it must have been his mother's. John took her left hand, his grip warm and certain, and slipped the ring on her finger. It fit like it was made for her. "With this ring I thee wed," he murmured. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Thomas closed his Bible, smiling. "You may kiss your bride, Mrs. Walker." John paused for just a heartbeat, then leaned in and gave her a gentle kiss. It was short and proper, nothing like the romances in her books, but she felt the promise there all the same. When he drew back, his eyes asked a question. She gave a slight nod, letting him know she was okay with all of this. Tom slapped John's shoulder, smiling wide. "Congratulations, boss. Mrs. Walker, welcome to our family." "Thank you, Tom," she said, the name Mrs. Walker feeling new on her lips. She was a wife now, tied to this man and this ranch. Their wedding feast was simple, just some chicken and the bread she had baked earlier to keep her hands from shaking. The preacher visited for about an hour, sharing news from around the territory before he rode on. As dusk settled in, Tom and Davy vanished to the bunkhouse, giving them looks that made Elizabeth blush. She kept busy with the cleanup, feeling John moving around the room, adding a log to the fire on a night that was plenty warm. "Elizabeth," he said at last. She turned from the wash basin to look at him. "About where we will be sleeping." "We are married," she stated, sounding braver than she was. "We should be in the same room." He walked over to her, stopping so close she had to look up to see his face. "I want you to be comfortable. There is no hurry for anything you are not ready for." His thoughtfulness moved her, but she had already settled this in her heart the night before. "I am ready," she said quietly. "I want a real marriage, John. I want us to be true partners." A hot, bright look flashed in his eyes. "Then we will," he said, reaching for her hand, her gold ring glinting in the light. "I will be gentle, Elizabeth. I give you my word." A warmth rushed to her face, but she held his gaze. "I trust you." He guided her to his room, which was now theirs, shutting the door softly. The room was simple, with just a bed, a dresser, and a wardrobe, but it was all neat and tidy. John lit the lamp on the nightstand, which cast a soft light, and then he turned to her. "I have never done this," Elizabeth confessed, her voice just a soft whisper. "I know how it all works." But I have not either, John said, and his words truly surprised her. I figured I would wait for the right woman to marry, and I believe I have found her now. His kind words chased away the last of her fears. She moved near and laid her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady under her palm. Then we can learn together. John held her face in his hands and kissed her once more, slower and more sure. A warmth bloomed deep inside Elizabeth, something she had never felt, and she leaned into him, wanting more without thinking. His arms wrapped around her, holding her to his solid warmth as the kiss grew deeper, turning into something vital and needed. They came together with a gentle passion that surprised them both, learning each other with touch and whispered words. John kept his word, being so careful and mindful, leading Elizabeth through new feelings with a true patience. When they finally lay together, breathless and tangled up, Elizabeth felt like a different person. This was all real now. They were truly joined. "Are you okay?" John asked, his voice husky while he smoothed her damp hair back from her face. "Yes," Elizabeth said, meaning it with all her heart. "More than all right." He drew her in closer against his side, and they lay there in a peaceful quiet as their breathing settled down. Outside the window, stars started to pop out in the dimming sky, and off in the distance, you could hear the cattle lowing softly. "Thank you for taking a chance on me," John said softly, "for making this long journey on faith alone." "Thank you for taking my chickens," Elizabeth answered, feeling his chest rumble with a laugh against her cheek. "It was the best choice I ever made," he said, kissing her hair. "Getting a wife and some chickens all in one day makes this ranch a whole lot richer." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, and at first light Elizabeth woke to feel his arm still holding her waist, keeping her near even as he slept. She let herself just soak in his warmth for a moment, the comforting solid reality of her new life before she slipped out of bed to start her very first day as a rancher's wife. The kitchen was chilly and dark, but it did not take Elizabeth long to get a fire crackling and set coffee to brew. She located flour and the other fixings, gathering everything she needed to make a real breakfast. By the time John came out of the bedroom, his hair all messy and shirt half done, the whole house smelled of bacon and fresh biscuits. "You did not need to be up this early," he told her, but his look was warm watching her move so sure-footed in the kitchen. "Ranchers rise with the sun," Elizabeth told him, "and I plan to do the same." Tom and Davy showed up soon after, pulled in by the smell of a hot meal, and they all sat down to big fluffy biscuits, bacon, eggs from her hens, and stout coffee. The men discussed their chores while Elizabeth mentally listed all that she wanted to accomplish. The garden had to be tended to right away. The house needed a good cleaning, and she aimed to plan a real chicken coop. "I figure I will work in the garden today," Elizabeth said as they were finishing up, "and maybe start clearing out a spot for a bigger coop." "Davy can give you a hand with that coop," John offered. "It needs to be built before the winter sets in. Me and Tom have to go check the north fence, but we ought to be back around mid-afternoon." The chores were sorted out quick and easy, and Elizabeth was happy with how she was already a natural part of running the ranch. After the men rode off, she put on her old work dress and a kerchief, then went out to the overgrown garden with her tools. The sun got higher as Elizabeth kept working, yanking weeds and turning over soil that had been ignored for a long while. Even though the work was hard, she liked it, seeing the promise in every row she cleared. She spotted the few plants still hanging on and made a note in her mind of what to plant next year. The growing season here in Montana was shorter than back in Pennsylvania, but if she planned it right, they could have fresh vegetables most of the year. Davy came by mid-morning and showed Elizabeth a level spot by the barn that was just right for the new chicken coop. "Mr. Walker wants it built real sturdy," the boy said, his young voice breaking on a word or two. "The coyotes and foxes out here are mighty persistent." They worked for a few hours measuring and sawing wood, talking about the best way to build it so the hens would be safe and have room. Elizabeth was really impressed by how much Davy knew about building, and the boy just seemed to thrive with her patient questions about his work. "My daddy taught me," Davy said with pride as they put the boards together. "He said a man ought to know how to build things himself." "Your father sounds like a smart man," Elizabeth told him. "And you are a very good student. This coop is going to be the finest in the county." Davy's face turned red with pride, and he got back to framing with new energy. John and Tom got back late in the day, and John went looking for Elizabeth right away, finding her in the garden, dressed dirty and hair damp with sweat. She heard his boots and looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and her smile made his heart give a little squeeze. "This garden is already looking much better," John noted, swinging off his horse to look at her work. "It has a good foundation," Elizabeth said, pointing to the tidy rows. "With a little care, it will do just fine. I found some wild potato plants and late squash that ought to be ready before the first frost." John saw all her hard work, the neat rows and cared-for plants, and a feeling of thanks washed over him so strong it nearly buckled his knees. In not even 2 full days, this woman had already changed the ranch for the better. Even more, she looked happy, like the hard work gave her energy instead of wearing her out. "You ought to rest now," he said. "You have done more than enough for today." Elizabeth stood up straight, a hand on her back. "I guess I can stop for a bit. I need to go check on my chickens, and then—" "Let's go check on those chickens while supper gets started," John said, offering his arm. Elizabeth took it, and he steadied her as they walked to the new coop being built by the barn. The hens seemed happy in their temporary pen, scratching around for bugs. Old Henry the rooster strutted about, watching over his flock like a king. John was surprised how much he liked having the birds around, bringing some life to the ranch. "Davy sure did a fine job today," Elizabeth commented, looking over the new coop. "He is a talented boy. Tom has taught him right," John replied. "He will be a good rancher one day." They stood there a moment watching the chickens, with Elizabeth's hand still on his arm. The simple peace of it all hit them both. This is what being married is, John thought. It was not about big shows or endless thrills, but about working together and enjoying the small things, building a life. "Are you happy, Elizabeth?" The words were out before he could stop them. She turned, her green eyes looking right into his. "I truly am. Are you?" "Yes," John answered, surprised by how sure he sounded, more than I ever figured I would be. Elizabeth gave a small smile, rested her head on his shoulder for a moment, then turned to go back to the house. John watched her walk away, admiring how straight she stood and the sure way she moved. He had married a woman he barely knew just 3 days ago, but it felt like she was meant to be here. Supper that night was another good, hearty meal. Elizabeth could tell the men appreciated the better cooking. She had discovered some canned tomatoes in the cellar and made a thick sauce for the venison Tom provided. There were also fresh biscuits and the last of the canned peaches. "Ms. Walker, if you keep this up, we are all going to get too fat to work," Tom said with a grin, patting his full belly. "I do not think so," Elizabeth answered with a laugh. "Y'all work too hard to get lazy." After supper, Tom and Davy left them be, and Elizabeth and John settled into their habit of doing the dishes. This was becoming their quiet time together at the end of the day, talking about this and that while they worked. "I've got to go to Red Creek for supplies next week," John mentioned while drying a dish. "You ought to come along. You can meet some folks and pick up anything you need for the house." "I would like that very much," Elizabeth said. "It is time I properly introduced myself to Ms. Collins and check out the general store. I will need to get some thread and material for new curtains." "New curtains?" John glanced around the room as if he had not noticed it before. "The ones we have now are about to fall to pieces," Elizabeth explained gently, "and some new fabric would surely brighten things up." John saw his house through her eyes then, realizing how worn and plain it had become while he lived alone. "Do what you think is best," he told her. "Make it feel like a proper home." The trust in his voice touched her more than he knew. He was letting her take charge of his home, asking her to make it theirs. "I will," she promised him. Later that night, they were together again, more comfortable with each other this time. John was a kind and patient partner, paying close attention to her. Afterward, lying close in the quiet dark, she felt a powerful urge to protect this man and the new life they were making. Their days fell into a steady rhythm. Elizabeth was up at dawn to make breakfast, then spent her mornings in the garden or tidying the house. In the afternoons, she helped out wherever she could. The chicken coop was finished in just a few days, built solid with good airflow and a strong latch that would keep any critters out. The chickens took to their new home right away, and they started laying more eggs once they were settled. Elizabeth's garden was thriving with all her hard work. She picked the vegetables that were ready and began to plan for the next year, writing down what grew best. The squash she planted late gave her a few good ones to store in the root cellar with the potatoes. They rode into Red Creek on a beautiful September morning, sitting together in the wagon. The town was buzzing with more folks than when Elizabeth first arrived, with wagons crowding the general store. Martha Collins saw them ride off and came bustling over with a big smile. "Ms. Walker, it is so wonderful to see you. You are looking well." "Thank you, Miss Collins. And please call me Elizabeth, only if you will call me Martha." The woman took Elizabeth's arm like they were old friends. "You have to tell me everything. Is John treating you right?" "Very well," Elizabeth said, noticing John was handling business but also keeping an eye on her. "He is a fine man." "I told you he was," Martha declared with satisfaction. "So what brings you all to town?" Elizabeth told her about needing material and sewing things, so Martha led her straight to the general store. Inside, it was a bit dark, but crammed full of all sorts of merchandise. The owner, a portly man named Samuel Jacobson, said hello to John and then looked at Elizabeth with interest. "Ms. Walker, welcome. What can I get for you today?" Elizabeth had a nice time picking out cloth, thread, and other things she knew they needed. John had given her plenty of money for the house, and she was careful to buy practical things along with a few comforts. While she shopped, John took care of his own errands, ordering supplies and hearing the local news. He found out rustlers had hit some ranches to the south, and the governor was talking about sending more lawmen out. It was news to keep in mind, but nothing to act on just yet. After loading up the wagon, John helped Elizabeth up. His hands stayed on her waist a moment longer than they needed to. She smiled up at him, liking the small, close feeling of the gesture and how they were starting to show their feelings in quiet ways. The ride home was pleasant. Elizabeth shared the town news from Martha, while John told her the serious updates from Mr. Jacobson. They talked about the ranch, wondering if they should get more cattle or just improve the herd they had. "Tom reckons we ought to think about raising horses," John said. "Good money in it, and we have the land." "Would we need to hire more hands for that?" Elizabeth asked. "Most likely, but not until spring," John said, then looked over at her. "What do you think?" That he asked for her thoughts on the ranch business made Elizabeth feel a rush of warmth. "I think Tom knows his business. He seems to have a good feel for things." "He does," John said. "I will think on it." Fall arrived in the Montana Territory, and it was a sight to behold. The cottonwoods by the creek went gold, and the aspens on the mountainside shone yellow against the green pines. The cows got their thick winter coats, and the chickens puffed up against the chill. Elizabeth had changed the whole feel of the house. New, colorful curtains were in the windows, making the rooms cheerful even when it was overcast. She had made cushions for the chairs and was working on a bright quilt for their bed in the evenings, as John did the books or fixed tack. The place had her touches now, with wildflowers in old bottles and some of her drawings of the land on the walls. One evening, John came inside to see Elizabeth up on a chair, hanging a shelf Davy had built for her. "What are you up to?" he asked, walking over to her. "Putting up a shelf for the nice dishes," she replied, holding a hammer. "I found them in a box and figured they ought to be out." "Get down from there before you break your neck," John said, sounding more amused than mad. He held the chair steady for her, and when she was done, he lifted her down, his hands easily circling her waist. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, a little out of breath from the work and from him being so close. His touch could still make her heart beat faster. "It looks like a real home now," John said, looking around, clearly pleased. "My mother would have loved what you have done." Elizabeth leaned against him, her head on his chest. "Tell me about your folks," You hardly ever mention them." John was silent for a bit. Then his arms wrapped around her. "My father was a good, honest man who worked hard and had a dream for the future this ranch could have. My mama was tough and practical, but had the gentlest soul. She made this house a home, even through the coldest winters." "You must miss them something awful," Elizabeth said softly. "Every single day, but more so now, wishing they could meet you, see what we're building here." John gently kissed the top of her head. "They would have loved you, Elizabeth. The way you've made this land flourish, how you work right beside us and never complain. My mama would have truly admired your grit." Elizabeth felt her eyes well up. She hadn't known how badly she needed to hear those words, to feel like she was part of this place's history. "I do wish I could have met them." "Oh, they're here," John said, motioning to the room. "In every timber and plank in the soil itself. And now you're a part of that story, too." They stood there in the soft lamplight, holding one another, and his words settled deep in her bones. She wasn't just some stranger who showed up with a box of chickens anymore. She belonged here, woven right into the life of this ranch. October brought the first hard frost, and Elizabeth spent her days putting up the last of the garden's bounty. She canned vegetables, dried herbs, and made jelly from wild berries she and Davy picked down by the creek. The root cellar filled up with winter supplies, with neat rows of jars and bins of potatoes, squash, and onions. The hens kept on laying, though they slowed down as the days got shorter. Elizabeth gathered the eggs each morning, enjoying the simple pleasure of their warm, smooth shells. She used some for their meals and started packing the rest in salt to keep them for winter when the hens would quit laying altogether. John and Tom put in long days getting the ranch ready for winter, mending fences, checking the barn and outbuildings, and moving the herd to winter pastures. It was hard, demanding work, and John often got in long after sundown, dog-tired and hungry. Elizabeth always had a hot supper waiting, and she found a quiet joy in taking care of him that way, giving him the food and comfort he needed for the next day's labor. One evening in late October, Elizabeth realized her monthly time was late. She had been so caught up in her work she hadn't paid it much mind. But standing in the kitchen and counting the days, the truth hit her like a ton of bricks. She might be carrying a child. The idea stirred up a storm of feelings inside her. Joy fought with fear, and a powerful urge to protect the little life maybe growing inside her. She didn't say a word to John that night, wanting to be sure before getting his hopes up, but she found herself looking at him in a whole new light. He would be a fine father, she thought. He was patient and strong, with a deep well of gentleness he kept mostly hidden from the world. 2 weeks later, with still no sign of her monthly and morning sickness becoming a plain fact of life, Elizabeth knew it was time to tell John. She waited till after supper, after Tom and Davy had gone to the bunkhouse and the two of them were alone in the quiet house. "John, I have something to tell you," Elizabeth said, her hands wringing her apron nervously. He looked up from a rope he was fixing, his attention caught by the serious tone of her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong, at least I don't believe so." Elizabeth took a deep breath to steady her nerves. "I believe I'm expecting." The rope slipped from John's hands as he just stared at her, his face showing shock, then doubt, then a slow dawning wonder. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor saying so. I've missed my time twice now, and I've been feeling poorly in the mornings." Elizabeth watched him, worried, trying to read his face. John crossed the room in 3 long steps and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could hardly catch her breath. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Elizabeth, that's just wonderful. That's the best news I could ever hear." Relief washed over her, and she was suddenly laughing and crying all at once. "So you are happy?" "Happy." John pulled back just enough to hold her face in his hands, his blue eyes burning bright. "I'm more than happy. You've already given me so much, but this, a family, it's more than I ever let myself hope for." He kissed her then, pouring all his happiness and love into it. When they finally parted, both of them breathing heavy, John kept a hand resting on her still flat belly. "We've got to be careful," he said. "You shouldn't be working so hard." "No more heavy liftin'," or John Elizabeth cut him off, putting her hand over his. "I am expectin' a baby, not made of glass. Women have been having babies and doing their work since the beginning of time. I'll be careful, but I won't be treated like an invalid." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have seen the firm set of her jaw. "Just promise me you'll ask for help when you need it. Promise you won't take any foolish chances." "I promise," Elizabeth said, and she sealed it with another kiss. They told Tom and Davy the next morning at breakfast, and the two men offered their heartfelt congratulations. Tom insisted on taking over some of Elizabeth's heavier chores, and Davy shyly gave her a little wooden cradle he had started carving, even though it wouldn't be needed for many months. Winter came on for real in November, bringing deep snows and temperatures that plunged way below freezing. The ranch settled into the slower pace of the cold months, with the work centered on feeding the stock and keeping the buildings in good repair. Elizabeth spent more of her time inside, sewing baby clothes from soft flannel she'd bought on another trip to Red Creek before the weather turned too bad. Her pregnancy went along just fine, though the morning sickness hung on longer than she would have liked. By December, her belly had started to show, and John had become so protective it was almost funny. He'd hover near her in the kitchen, ready to catch her if she so much as wobbled. And he started doing chores Elizabeth could handle perfectly well on her own. "If you don't stop treating me like I'm going to shatter, I'm going to lose my temper," Elizabeth said one snowy afternoon, her voice sharp with frustration. John looked hurt. "I'm just trying to keep you safe. I know, and I love you for it, but you have to trust me to know my own body." The words tumbled out before Elizabeth could stop them, and they both went still. "You love me?" John asked, his voice low. Heat rushed to Elizabeth's face, but she held his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I never meant to fall in love with you, but I have. Somewhere between the chickens and the garden, and all the little moments of building this life, I fell in love with you, John Walker." Pure joy lit up his face, making him look young and carefree. "I love you." "You too, Elizabeth. For weeks, maybe more, but I was too scared to speak it. I wasn't sure you could feel the same, if this deal we made could ever be different." "It is everything now," Elizabeth whispered, stepping into his embrace. "You are my whole world." Their kiss was full of a heat and softness, two souls finding a rare treasure, a love born from partnership that grew deep and true. That afternoon the baby stirred, a little thump against her ribs that stole her breath. "What's wrong?" John asked, startled. "The baby," Elizabeth gasped, guiding his hand to her belly. "Can you feel that?" They stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the small kick to happen again. John's eyes opened wide with awe, and Elizabeth watched tears roll down his face. "That's our little one," he murmured. "Our child." "Yes," Elizabeth replied, her own tears flowing. "Our family." Christmas arrived, and Elizabeth was determined to make it feel right, even way out on the ranch. She made cookies and served a ham Tom had prepared, strung up pine branches with colorful ribbon, and set up a trade of gifts. For John, she stitched a new shirt with cloth the color of his eyes. For Tom and Davy, she made warm scarves. The men had scraped together what they could to get Elizabeth a lovely shawl from town, made of soft, dark green wool that matched her eyes perfectly. They had their celebration together. The four of them sat around that table, and Elizabeth's heart was just full of thanks. Just 1 year back, she was lost and alone in Philadelphia. Now she had a man she adored, a place that was her own, and a baby coming soon. The road she took was not the one she had planned, but it brought her right home. The new year came in with a snowstorm that penned them all up inside for 3 whole days. Elizabeth baked bread, made soup, tended the fire, and sewed baby things while John wore a path in the floor, not used to being stuck indoors. When the weather finally cleared, Tom and Davy dug their way through snow up to their chests to get to the barn and see to the livestock. As January bled into February, You could really tell Elizabeth was expecting. Her belly was high and round, and the baby was always moving with strong kicks that made her flinch. John started talking to her belly at night, telling their little one all about the ranch, promising to teach them how to ride and tend the land. "And what if it's a girl?" Elizabeth asked one evening, smiling at his plans. "Then she will learn to ride and tend the land," John answered right away. "Any child of ours will know this ranch, no matter if they are a boy or a girl." Elizabeth just laughed and combed her fingers through his hair. "You are going to be a wonderful father." "I sure hope so," John said with a serious look. "I mean to give our children what my folks gave me, a safe home, a reason for being, and knowing they are loved." "You will," Elizabeth told him softly. "We both will." March came with the first whispers of spring, but snow was still on the ground and the air had a bite. Elizabeth was in her last days now, walking slow and not getting much rest, as the baby seemed to be turning flips inside her all night long. The doctor from Red Creek rode all the way out in late March, looked Elizabeth over and said all was as it should be. "The baby will be here in the next 2 weeks," he guessed. "You got someone to help with the birth?" "Martha Collins said she would come," Elizabeth answered. They had sent a message to Red Creek the week prior, and Martha swore she would be there once the roads cleared up. Martha showed up 3 days after that, and Elizabeth was so thankful for her steady hands and quiet confidence. Martha had brought dozens of babies into the world on the frontier, and just having her there calmed Elizabeth's fears about what was to come. Her time started on a clear April morning, just as the first wildflowers poked up from the wet ground. She woke with a deep ache that she first thought was another false start, like she had had before. But the pains got stronger and found a steady beat, and she knew without a doubt that this was the day. "John," she managed, grabbing his arm as another wave hit her hard. "It is time." The color drained from his face, but he moved fast, getting Elizabeth to the bed before rushing to get Martha from her room. The older woman was there in a flash, already dressed and set to go. "All right now, honey. Let's see what is what," Martha said, shooing John out of the room even as he objected. "You go on and find something to do. This part is for the women." For hours, John wore a path in the floor of the main room, making Tom and Davy anxious with his nervous pacing. He listened for any noise from the bedroom, his mind filling with every terrible thing that could go wrong. Elizabeth worked through the long day with Martha's calm voice to guide her. The pain was more than she ever thought it could be, coming in tides of fire that made her cry out though she tried to be still. But Martha just held her hand and spoke softly, telling her that women had been doing this forever, that she had the strength to see it through. As the sun began to set, turning the sky all gold and pink, Martha told Elizabeth it was time to push. She pushed with all the strength she had left, driven by a raw need to be done with it all. One more time. And then a wail filled the air, loud and mad at the world, and more beautiful than anything. "You have got a son," Martha said, tears on her weathered cheeks as she cleaned the child and swaddled him. "A fine, healthy boy." Elizabeth held out shaking arms, and Martha laid the little bundle on her. He had a mess of dark hair and a furious red face, tiny fists shaking at this new world. A wave of love washed over Elizabeth, so powerful it took her breath away. "Hello, my sweet boy," she murmured, tracing his tiny fingers. "I am your mama. You are safe with me. You are loved so much." Martha opened the door to call for John, who rushed in wild-eyed. He froze right there at the sight. Elizabeth was leaned against the pillows, holding their son, both of them alive, and looking fine. "Come see your son," Elizabeth said, her smile shining through tears of joy. John walked toward them like he was in a trance. He sat on the side of the bed, staring at the small face peeking out of the blankets. "He is so little," John whispered, his voice full of pure awe. "Would you like to hold him?" Elizabeth asked. John just nodded, not saying a word, as Elizabeth gently passed the baby into his arms. John cradled his son with such care. supporting his little head and looking down with pure love in his eyes. "Hello there, son," John managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I am your daddy. I swear I will always keep you from harm. I will teach you all I know, and I will love you for all my days." The baby quieted down, hearing his father speak, his cries turning into little sounds. Elizabeth looked at her husband and son, and her heart felt like it would burst right out of her chest. "What will we name him?" John asked, his eyes still fixed on the baby. Elizabeth had been wondering about that for weeks. "What was your father's name?" "William. William Thomas Walker." "Then he will be William, for your father and all he built, William Thomas Walker." John glanced up at her, his eyes bright. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. Your folks deserve to be honored in their grandson. They are a piece of him, a piece of this family we are making." Martha stayed on for a week, helping Elizabeth get her strength back and showing her how to care for a baby. Little William was a sweet child, ate well and slept for good long spells, but his folks still found themselves peeking in on him all the time, hardly believing this tiny miracle was theirs. John was a natural daddy right from the start. He would get up for night feedings to change the baby and bring him to Elizabeth, and then he would sit with them by the lamp while she nursed. He was always talking to William, telling him about every chore on the ranch like the little boy was taking it all in. "You are going to spoil that boy rotten," Elizabeth said one night with a soft smile, watching John patiently rock their son. "Cannot be done," John said, his eyes never leaving William's face. "He ought to have every bit of love we have got." Spring came on in full force, turning the brown hills into a sea of green with wildflowers sprinkled all over. Elizabeth slowly got her strength back, taking little walks with William held tight against her. The hens started laying again as the days got longer, and the garden was waiting for a new season's planting. Their whole life found a new beat, one set by the baby's needs. Elizabeth figured out how to get things done with William sleeping in a basket close by, his being there a constant comfort and push. John and Tom grew the herd with the new spring calves, and Davy shot up a few more inches, his voice finally deciding to stay low. By June, Elizabeth felt mostly like her old self again, and was working in the garden with a happy heart. William spent his days on the porch, his serious blue eyes so like his father's, watching the world go by. That boy was growing like a weed, his little baby softness turning into chubby cheeks and strong legs. "He will be on a horse before you know it," Tom remarked one afternoon, making silly faces at the baby as Elizabeth hung the wash. "Not a day too soon," Elizabeth answered, though she reckoned Tom was right. Ranch kids had to learn things early. John came around the house, covered in dust and bone-tired from the cattle, but a smile broke out when he saw his wife and son. He made a habit of coming home for a few minutes whenever he could, just not able to stay away. "How are my favorite folks doing?" John asked, lifting William high in the air, loving the sound of his boy's happy gurgle. "We are doing just fine," Elizabeth said, leaning her head on his strong shoulder. "And a whole lot better now that you are home." They just stood there in the sunshine with their son between them, and Elizabeth thought about the long road that brought her to this place. She had shown up in Montana a desperate woman with nothing, just a trunk and a crate full of chickens. Now she had a good husband she loved with all her heart, a son who was her sunshine, and a home that felt like the center of her whole world. "You ever sorry you did it?" John asked softly, like he was reading her mind. "Leaving Philadelphia, coming all this way to marry a man you did not know." Elizabeth looked him right in the eye, letting him see every bit of truth she had. "Never. Not for one single second. This is where I belong, John. Right here with you, building this life. I would do it all over again 1,000 times." He kissed her then, a gentle and sweet kiss that was both a promise and a celebration. William wiggled between them, wanting attention, and they laughed as they pulled apart. That first year of William's life flew by in a blur of sleepless nights and so many little blessings. He went from a tiny baby to a curious little crawler, always pulling himself up on things, trying to get to what was next. His first word was DA, which made John prouder than a peacock. Elizabeth reminded him that Mama came just a week later. The ranch did well with both of them working it. Elizabeth's garden gave them plenty, and she spent the end of summer putting up food for the winter. The chickens had multiplied, with hens hatching new chicks that soon joined the flock. John and Tom started breeding horses like they planned, and the first crop of foals looked mighty promising. By the time William turned 1 in April of 1884, the Walker Ranch was known as one of the best-run spreads in the whole area. Other ranchers would come to John for his opinion, and folks all over the territory started doing things their way. But the real sign of their success, Elizabeth thought as she watched William take his first shaky steps to his daddy's open arms, was not in how many cattle they had or how much money they made. It was in the family they were building, the love that filled up their little house, and the future they were making together. One warm May evening, with William fast asleep and the ranch all quiet, John and Elizabeth sat on the porch watching the sun go down. His arm was wrapped around her, and she leaned against him, feeling perfectly content. "I have been thinking," John said, "about making the house bigger, maybe adding a room or two. William's going to need his own room, and if we are blessed with more little ones—" His voice trailed off, asking a question without words. Elizabeth smiled, and her hand went to her belly where she figured a new life was starting to grow. She had not told him yet, wanting to be sure, but she knew the signs. "That is a wise thought," she said. "In fact, we might need it sooner than you think." John turned his head quick to look at her, with hope and understanding filling his eyes. "Elizabeth, are you telling me?" "I think I am with child again," Elizabeth said, her smile breaking free. "It is early, but yes, I think William is going to be a big brother." John pulled her close, his happiness just as big as it was the first time. "This family just keeps getting richer," he said, saying the same words he did the day she showed up with her chickens. "And I love you more and more every single day." "I love you too," Elizabeth whispered, and kissed him. "Thank you for taking a gamble on a woman with nothing but a crate of chickens." "You were the brave one, coming all this way to build a life with me," John said back. "You are the finest thing that ever happened to me, Elizabeth Walker. You and our children are my whole world." They sat there as the sky grew dark, making plans and dreaming about what was to come. Ranching would always be hard. Elizabeth knew there would be tough winters and dry seasons, losses that would test their spirit, but they would face it all side by side, bound by love. The chickens were already settled in their coop for the night, the very same birds that had crossed the country in a crate 2 years before. They had been the one steady thing for her when nothing else was certain, and their arrival on the ranch was the start of all the good things in her life. Out in the pasture, the cattle settled down for the night. From inside the house, William made soft, sleepy sounds. And right there on the porch, Elizabeth and John held on to each other. Two folks who found love in the strangest way and built a beautiful life with grit and faith. Their second child, a little girl they named Margaret Rose for Elizabeth's grandmother, was born in January of 1885. It was a snowy day that made Elizabeth think of when William was born. This time the labor was quicker, and John was only a little bit less scared. Margaret had her mama's green eyes and red hair, and her daddy was wrapped around her little finger from the start. William, who was now 20 months old, was taken with his new sister, always wanting to touch her with his sticky little hands. Elizabeth and John watched them close, teaching him to be gentle and what it meant to be a big brother. The new part of the house John planned was finished by spring, adding 2 bedrooms and a bigger kitchen. Elizabeth fixed up the children's rooms with quilts she had stitched while she was expectant and curtains from bright, happy cloth. William's room had little wooden animals that Davy had carved for him, while Margaret's room had a cradle that John built himself, wanting his daughter to have something made with love. Life with 2 little ones was a wonderful kind of chaos and wore them out. But Elizabeth had never been so happy. She had found her place in this wild part of Montana, raising her family and helping the ranch grow. The scared woman who showed up with just her hope and some chickens seemed like another person entirely, replaced by someone strong and sure, with roots planted deep in this land. Tom got married in the winter of 1885, and his new wife, Sarah, moved into the bigger bunkhouse. Sarah was a widow who knew how to work and had a kind spirit, and she and Elizabeth became good friends. Davy, now 17, was courting a girl from Red Creek with talk that he might claim some land next to theirs to start his own place. The little community around them was getting bigger, and the Walker Ranch was like an anchor for folks, a place for parties and for sharing what you knew. Elizabeth got known for her good cooking and warm welcome, and their house was often full of visitors. On a summer night in 1886, as William played outside and Margaret slept in her crib, Elizabeth looked over it all with a full heart. The garden was green and full. The chickens were doing fine under the care of a couple of hens who were mighty fine mamas, and the sound of the kids laughing was everywhere. Down in the corral, John and Tom worked the horses, moving together in that easy way that comes from years of shared work. John looked up and saw Elizabeth watching him. Even from that far off, she felt his love just as strong as it was when they were first married. He smiled and lifted a hand, and she waved right back, her heart feeling like it would just about bust. That night, when the kids were all tucked in and the ranch was quiet, Elizabeth and John laid in bed and talked about what was to come. They talked about the children and their hopes for them, and about their plans for the ranch. But mostly they just held one another, thankful for the life they'd made. "You remember that first day?" John asked, his fingers drawing little circles on her arm. "When you got off that stagecoach holding that crate of chickens and everybody just stared?" Elizabeth chuckled. "I was scared to death you were fixing to send me straight back to Philadelphia. It never occurred to me that showing up with chickens to meet a man might be a bit odd." "That was the minute I knew you were something else," John said. "I mean it. You had the nerve to hold on to what was yours, even if it could have cost you the whole deal. That is just who you are, Elizabeth, a woman who loves with everything she has and can build something beautiful from scratch." "We did it together," Elizabeth said back. "I had the chickens, but you gave me a home, a partner, and a love I never dreamed of. You're the one who made me brave, John." "You always were brave," he told her. "I just gave you a place for that bravery to really shine." They were together that night with a kindness and fire that only comes when two people know each other's souls. Afterward, they just laid there all tangled up. Elizabeth rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I sure love this life," Elizabeth whispered in the dark. "I love you and our children and this ranch and even the hard times, all of it." "I love it too," John said, pulling her closer. "And I love you more than I can say. You're my whole world, Elizabeth. You and the kids are the reason for all of this." The years kept rolling on, with their share of good times and troubles. They got through hard winters and dry summers. They welcomed new babies and said goodbye to loved ones. William grew into a thoughtful boy who loved the ranch as much as his father, while Margaret was smart as a whip and fearless at home in the barn or the house. A third child, another boy they called Thomas for Tom Brennan, came along in 1888, and their family was complete. The ranch grew and changed as they added more land and tried new ventures. John's horse breeding business got known all over, and they started selling good horses to folks far and wide. Elizabeth's chickens, the descendants of those original 6 from Pennsylvania, were now a flock of dozens, giving them eggs for the family and some cash from selling to neighbors. Davy married his girl, and sure enough, he settled on land right next to the Walkers, building his own place with help from Tom and John. He stayed close with the family, coming over for Sunday dinners and bringing his own kids to play. Montana became a state in 1889, and the Walkers celebrated with everyone, knowing it was a big deal, but also knowing that the rhythm of the ranch wouldn't change. The land still needed the same hard work. The cattle had to be tended, and the seasons just kept on turning. On a crisp fall morning in 1890, Elizabeth was in her garden getting the last of the vegetables. She was 31 years old by then. Her hands were rough from work, and her face had the first little lines from the sun and wind. But she had never felt prettier or stronger or more herself. William, who was 6, was helping Tom with the horses, his small hands trying to do everything just like the old rancher. 4-year-old Margaret was helping Elizabeth, which was mostly just digging in the dirt and talking non-stop. Little 2-year-old Thomas toddled after his dad, who was fixing a fence close by. This was her whole world, all the noise and mess, the never-ending work, and a love that filled every single corner of the place. Elizabeth stood up straight, put a hand on her back, and just looked at her family spread out across the ranch. John caught her eye and gave her that smile, the one that was only for her, and she felt that familiar rush of love. They had made something truly special here, something that would last. Their children would get more than just land and cattle. They would get the value of hard work and the knowledge that a home is built with love. The chickens were scratching around in their big new coop. There were dozens of them now, where there used to be just 6 scared birds in a box. It was a perfect picture of what she and John had done, she thought. They started with hardly anything and had built so much, just by taking care and leaning on each other. That evening, as they always did, the family gathered for supper around the big table Elizabeth had made John build for their growing family. William said grace, his young voice sure and steady, thanking God for the food in their home. They all ate and talked about their day, making plans for the next, just enjoying being together in the warm lamplight. After the kids were in bed, Elizabeth and John sat in their spots on the porch, wrapped up in blankets against the cold. The sky was full of stars, and far off, a wolf howled its lonesome tune. "Do you ever wonder how different things could have been?" Elizabeth asked. "If I had never answered your letter, if you had picked someone else, if my chickens hadn't made it." "Sometimes," John said. "But I can't imagine any life being better than this one. You're my person, Elizabeth. We were meant to find each other. It all happened just like it was supposed to." "I feel the exact same way," Elizabeth said quietly. "All the hard parts and the sad times, they all led us to right now. I wouldn't change a single thing about it." They sat quiet for a spell. They were two people who didn't need words anymore, whose love was as natural as breathing. The whole ranch was asleep around them, the animals were settled, and the kids were dreaming in their beds. "Thank you," John said at last, "for taking a leap of faith, for getting on that stagecoach with your chickens and heading into the unknown. Thank you for choosing me, for making this life with me, for giving me a purpose. You made me whole again, Elizabeth." "You did the same for me," Elizabeth answered, leaning against him. "I was so lost before I came here, not knowing who I was or where I was going. You gave me a place to belong, and the chance to be the person I was always meant to be. You saw that I was strong when I didn't see it myself." "I love you," John said, and the words held all the weight of their 8 years together. "I love you too," Elizabeth answered. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that." They stayed out on the porch till the cold finally chased them inside. They went to their room, checking on each of the children before getting into their own bed. Elizabeth curled up against John, her head on his shoulder, and felt that deep-down peace of someone who had found her place in the world. The seasons kept on turning, and the Walker family grew right along with them. William turned out to have his daddy's knack for ranching, with a real feel for the cattle and the land. Margaret had a special touch with horses, able to calm down the wildest ones with just her patience. Young Thomas was still finding his way, but he seemed to have his mother's green thumb, spending all his time helping Elizabeth in the garden. The frontier was getting a little tamer, but the Walker Ranch held on to its character, a place where hard work and your word meant more than anything. They had built something that would last, a legacy for their children and their children's children, showing what two people could do when they pulled together. On a spring morning in 1893, Elizabeth turned 34 and was surrounded by her family. The kids had made her cards, and John gave her a beautiful shawl he had ordered from a catalog. They ate cake that Margaret helped bake, and the whole day was full of laughter. That evening, after the party was over and the kids were all in bed, Elizabeth and John walked up the small hill that overlooked their ranch. The sunset was putting on a show, painting the sky with pink and gold while the land rolled out before them like a green ocean. 11 years, Elizabeth said, her voice full of wonder. Has it really been 11 years since I got here with my chickens? 11 of the best years of my life, John said, and I hope we have a lot more just like them. Many more, Elizabeth agreed, and she took his hand. Growing old right here on this ranch, watching our babies grow up and start their own families, making more memories every day. This place sure did get richer, John said, repeating those words from the first time they met. But it is not the cattle or the horses or the chickens that made it rich. It is you, Elizabeth. Your love, your strength, your being here with me. You are what makes this place rich. Elizabeth turned and put her hands on his weathered cheeks. And you are mine. Every good thing in my life began the day I met you. My home is you, John Walker. Not this land, not this house, but you. Wherever you are, that is my home. They kissed as the sun disappeared, a promise for a love that had been through it all and come out stronger. When they finally headed back to the house, hand in hand, the first stars were coming out. Old lights that had watched over them from the very start. Untold human stories over the years. But this one, the story of a mail-order bride with a crate of chickens and the cowboy who saw her real worth, was one of the truly good ones. It was a story of courage and hope, of two lonesome people who took a risk on each other and built a beautiful life from next to nothing. The ranch would carry on for generations, and the Hartley name would come to mean quality cattle and fair dealings all through Montana and beyond. But the real legacy that Elizabeth and John built wasn't counted in acres or livestock. It was counted in love given without question, in children raised upright, in a partnership that showed what two people could do when they worked together with respect. The chickens, those dependable hens that had come so far in a wooden box, lived out their full lives and were eventually succeeded by their own offspring. But Elizabeth never forgot those first 6 birds. How they had been her only friends through scary and uncertain times, and how their arrival at the ranch had signaled the start of everything good in her life. Years later, when Elizabeth was an old woman with children and grandchildren all around her, someone asked her the secret to her long, happy marriage and her successful life. She smiled, her green eyes still twinkling, and said simply, "I brought everything I had to the table, even when it was only 6 chickens in a wooden crate. And John saw the value in what I brought. He saw the value in me. We built everything from that, piece by piece, day after day, always side by side. That's the real secret. Finding someone who sees what you're worth and choosing to build a beautiful life together." John, sitting right beside her, their hands linked like they had been for over 50 years, gave her fingers a gentle squeeze. "Best deal I ever made," he said, telling her this ranch just got a whole lot richer. I had no idea back then just how true that would turn out to be. They lived long, full lives together, Elizabeth and John, passing away within months of each other as old folks who were blessed with children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. The ranch thrived under their son William's good care, and then was passed to his own children, with each generation adding to it while holding on to the values John and Elizabeth had started with. And in the chicken coop, there were always hens that came from those original Rhode Island Reds Elizabeth brought from Pennsylvania. Their eggs fed the family and kept a living link to the woman who started it all. The story of the mail-order bride who came with chickens became a family, a story told over and over again. It was a reminder that big things can come from a little bit of nerve and a heart willing to take a leap on love. The big Montana sky went on forever above, with mountains watching over the land, and the Walker Ranch stood as proof of what Elizabeth and John built. Their love story, made strong by the tough and beautiful frontier, showed that sometimes the strangest starts make for the very best endings. And it showed that if you give all you have got to something new, you might find the home you were always looking for was also looking for you, too. The end of their tale was just the start of something that would last for many years to come. It all started when a determined woman got off a stagecoach carrying chickens, and a lonesome cowboy realized his whole world had just gotten richer than he could have ever imagined. Not because of the chickens, though they surely helped, but because of the courageous, strong, and loving woman who carried them. The woman who would be his partner, his love, and his whole world. The woman that turned his house into a real home, and his lonely life into one full of meaning and happiness. Elizabeth and John Walker made their own happy ending right from the ground up, with just faith, hope, and 6 chickens in a box. And as it turned out, that was more than enough. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is bring everything they have, even if it seems small, and trust that someone will see its worth. This channel tells stories of the Wild West, of cowboys, love, motherhood, human kindness, compassion, and the quiet strength between people. The story you're about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
This was never just a tale about a mail-order bride or a struggling rancher. It was a story about courage in its purest form, the kind that doesn't roar but quietly persists. Clara did not arrive with wealth, status, or certainty. She came with a small trunk, a crate of chickens, and something far more valuable, the willingness to bring her whole self into the unknown. And James, a man hardened by loss and solitude, chose not to measure her worth by what the world might consider practical, but by the strength and spirit she carried within her. What we witness in their journey is the slow, steady transformation of 2 lives that could have remained lonely and incomplete had they chosen fear over faith. Instead, they chose to build, day by day, task by task, season by season. There was no instant miracle, no sudden change of fortune. The ranch did not become rich overnight. Love did not ignite in a single moment. It grew quietly, like seeds planted in difficult soil, nurtured by patience, respect, and shared purpose. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story offers us, that the most meaningful things in life are not found. They are built. Built through effort, through compromise, through the small, ordinary acts that many overlook. A shared meal after a long day, a hand offered in silence, a promise kept when no one is watching. These are the foundations upon which something lasting is created. Clara's chickens, humble and almost laughable to those who first saw them, became a symbol of this truth. They represented continuity, care, and quiet resilience. What seemed insignificant at first became essential over time. And isn't that how life often works? The smallest parts of who we are, the things we sometimes feel insecure about bringing into new spaces, can become the very things that enrich our lives and the lives of others. There is also a deeper truth here about partnership. Clara and James did not rescue each other in the way stories often suggest. Instead, they met as equals in hardship. Each brought something the other lacked. Each respected the other's strength, and together they created something neither could have achieved alone. This is not a story of dependency, it is a story of mutual growth, of 2 individuals choosing again and again to stand side by side rather than walk alone. For the audience, the meaning resonates far beyond the setting of the Wild West. We all, at some point, stand at our own version of Red Creek Station, facing uncertainty, carrying the weight of our past, unsure of what awaits us. The question is not whether we are ready. The question is whether we are willing to step forward despite fear, willing to trust that what we bring, no matter how small it seems, has value, willing to believe that somewhere ahead there is a place where we can belong. This story reminds us that home is not something we stumble upon, it is something we create. It is built through love, through shared struggle, through the quiet decision to stay when leaving would be easier. It is found in the people who see us clearly and choose us anyway. And perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us about hope. Not the fragile kind that depends on perfect outcomes, but the enduring kind that survives hardship. The kind that allows a young woman to cross a continent with nothing but faith. The kind that allows a man long accustomed to solitude to open his life to another. The kind that turns a simple ranch into a legacy that stretches across generations. So as this story comes to a close, we are reminded that greatness does not always come from grand beginnings. Sometimes it begins with 6 chickens in a wooden crate, a leap of faith, and 2 people willing to build something together from almost nothing. And in the end, that is more than enough.